Good morning. Thank you for having us, me and my distinguished panelists. It's a great honor to be here in Belgrade. I was actually saying to a couple of people, I've been to Belgrade like 4 times, but only ever for 6-7 hours before I had to go out again. It's really a fantastic city, and I'm very pleased to be here. So today we're going to talk about something that's extremely important, the future of journalism and what is responsible reporting in a digital age. Now, I came to this subject, I guess, head-on 11 years ago, or over 11 years ago, when I first entered Ukraine. Now, I entered Ukraine at the very end of March 2014, just after the seizure of Crimea. And I was sent there by a magazine in Britain for 1 week. But then war broke out, and I stayed for a year. And it was a very interesting experience for me. I had covered conflict just a few years earlier in the Congo, the Democratic Republic of Congo. 4 years later, I could have been reporting war in a different century. When I went out to eastern Ukraine, it was for the first time Twitter, which back then was not what it was today. It was a different sort of medium. Then Facebook, I think everyone was using a lot. But Twitter became my source of what was happening on the ground. If I wanted to plot a route as I went through different occupied cities, I would check social media. I wouldn't check the BBC. I wouldn't check CNN. I checked Twitter. And then when I got out to the east, something was bothering me about what I was seeing, and I initially couldn't put my finger on it. I was seeing tanks in the streets. I was seeing Russian soldiers in the streets, even though the Russians were then saying they were not in eastern Ukraine. And eventually it hit me. What I was seeing, I understood, was 2 wars. One that was being fought on the ground with tanks and guns and bullets, and the other that was being fought out online with tweets and posts and shares. And that counterintuitively, in some regards, it was the war online that mattered most. Now, why do I say this? Because back then, Putin did not want to do the classic thing in war. He did not want to march his soldiers into Kiev, raise the Russian flag over the capital, and annex Ukraine to Russia. The Russians wanted Crimea, they took it. What he was doing was something else. They were sending troops into parts of eastern Ukraine to carve out a space where they could pump in narratives. The Kiev government is a fascist junta. You know, Ukraine is not Russia. Because he did not then want to totally defeat Kiev and conquer it. What he wanted to do was destabilize it to the degree that it was never able to join NATO and the EU, but primarily NATO. And that was interesting to me because that was a political, not a military goal. Clausewitz said that war is the continuation of politics by other means. What I was seeing back then was politics, as it was war as armed politics. It was very interesting. And as a journalist, it posed, significant issues. In wartime, or as a responsible journalist, you always have to be wary of the facts. You always have to be wary of the truth. You can have an opinion. Excuse me. I think there are a lot of people on this panel, including myself, have strong opinions, and that's completely fine in journalism. There's no moral imperative to be neutral. There's certain subjects I say you can't be neutral about, but you have to tell the truth. That's just the law, the law of journalism. But what was very interesting to me then was that the information was coming faster and faster than ever. War is always a chaotic period. 2 things, I always say 2 things really spread in war, violence and rumors. It's very hard to sort of make out truth from fact when you're right in the middle of things. I remember a really big story, and I saw the results of this on the ground. The Russians they fabricated a story, and it was fabricated, as has been proved many times, that the Ukrainians had crucified a 13-year-old boy in the city of Sloviansk, where I actually had been in the early days of the war. It's complete nonsense, of course, but I saw the effects of this on the ground. I saw Russian soldiers inflicting violence, sort of brutality on Ukrainian people. I saw, I was there when certain things were bombed, and I could see online the Russians talking about this was revenge for that crucified boy. So what is responsible reporting in a digital age where the ability to spread falsehoods is greater than it's ever been? Now, the ability, obviously, to shine a light on subjects has also never been greater. You can now see, back in the day, you could see the brutality Assad was visiting on his own people. Perhaps before social media, this wouldn't have been possible. He'd have sealed up the country. Only friendly journalists, tame journalists, government journalists would have been able to report. Now you can see it. You can get it out. But how often do we see footage from Ukraine that turns out to be from somewhere else? How often do we see footage from Gaza that you look down, you drill down, turns out to be from Syria 7, 8 years earlier? Responsible reporting in a digital age, I would say, has a lot of benefits, but a great many challenges. When you seek the truth, overloads of information make everything harder. I think in many ways the 20th century was the age of trying to cover things up. You know, so many political scandals, the Watergate one being a classic, was of people trying to cover things up. It's almost impossible to the same degree to try and cover things up. What you see instead now are bad actors, whether you want to call them disinformation actors or fake news merchants, depending on which side of the spectrum you sit on. You overload people with information. You deluge them with information. I remember being in Ukraine, and I'm sure all of you remember or know about flight MH17 that was shot down over Ukraine. And I was in Kiev at the time. I'd just come back from the east. I'd just come back actually from Donbass, from Donetsk. And immediately you saw something kick into action. I was watching this in real time. Russia Today, all of these Sputnik, all of these things going, no, it wasn't the Russians, it was the Ukrainians. No, it was the Americans. No, it was the Ukrainians and the Americans. No, it was the Russians. And the goal wasn't actually to convince you of something. It was just to confuse, distort so much that the average person went, you know what, I've had enough, and just shut their laptop. Which incidentally is a very different sort of way of doing sort of propaganda. But, you know, it wasn't about the glory of Russia. It was just confuse, deny, obfuscate. So the ordinary person who's not like me, not like people on this panel, who has a life outside of this stuff, was just like, you know what, I want to go outside and have a drink. I'm sick and tired of this. Boom. And that's your win. And because I'm a bit like Jonah, everywhere I go descends to disaster. So I told you, I went to Ukraine for a week. A war broke out, so I stayed for a year. In February 2015, I was crouching in a hole in the ground in eastern Ukraine. It was minus 15. My iPhone quit switching off, and I was being bombed. And I said, well, I'll go to Greece to see my father. And then the financial crisis broke out in Greece. So I spent 6 months in Greece reporting on that. And once again, I ran into the same problems. Falsehoods, lies spread like wildfire across social media. I'd like to sort of leave you with a couple of thoughts. Think about certain things. Think about mobilization, the ability to mobilize, the ability to amplify messages. In the end, when you strip away social media, when you drill down, what does it do? It does two things. It can mobilize people and it amplifies messages. And a lot of the things that we think are good or can be good end up having hidden downsides. Take, for example, the Arab Spring, this series of revolutions that we saw in 2011. I remember people being astonished. And bear in mind, this is 13, 14 years ago now. The Arab, Facebook, as it was then, was mobilizing hundreds of thousands of people onto the street in hours. During the Islamic Revolution, the Ayatollah Khomeini would smuggle in tape recorders. They'd smuggle in his followers tape recorders of his sermons in Paris, where he was in exile. And for them to percolate around the Iranian people took about 2 years. You were mobilizing similar numbers of people, hundreds of thousands, in hours. But here's the problem. Because it was social media, because it was so diffuse, there was no leader. And what happened is when Mubarak eventually fell, the people had won, but there was no one to fill the void. Whereas where the Iranian revolutionaries won, Ayatollah Khomeini was immediately there to step in. So we live in an age where certain things, flows of information, the way that you seize, take, and hold power are completely different. And that raises serious challenges for journalists. It raises challenges on a technical level, because you have to at least understanding of the tech at a basic level. You have to have some understanding of how algorithms may and may not privilege your work, may downgrade your work. We know, for example, and this is the truth, that social media platforms were actually not shadow banning, but dampening a lot of what they perceive to be right-wing content over many years. So this is something new in the information landscape. This is something as a journalist, whether you write, whether you do TV, you have to be aware of. So I think at the moment it's a challenging time to be a journalist, but also an incredible time to be a journalist. Old Chinese proverb, may you live in interesting times. Well, I think it's clear to everybody that we live in interesting times. And I think that the Balkans region, and for a country like Serbia, which sits at a geopolitical crossroads across so many vital issues, both to Europe and the broader world, is a place where these kind of issues that I've talked about, that my distinguished panelists will talk about, are incredibly important, which is why I think it is so interesting and so valuable that we are having conferences like this here today. Now, I'm not going to rant at you anymore. I'm going to throw the floor open to my far more impressive distinguished fellow panelists. So shall we start with you, Stefan? Yeah, sure. And what will happen is each of my panelists will speak for about 10 minutes. They will talk about a couple of issues on this subject that they've encountered, and then perhaps we'll open up for a couple of questions so we don't all talk at you for the whole event. Thank you.
Thank you so much, and thank you for the great intro. I've also been through a lot in the last 14 or 15 years, reporting from many parts of the world, including Ukraine, and I can confirm that it was quite challenging even then, 14 years ago, or is it like 10? Yeah, 10 or 11, yeah, to distinguish the real news from the fake news. But I will play a devil's advocate now that you've said everything about the challenges we are facing as journalists in the last couple of years. I would say that everything changed and nothing changed, because I heard just a minute ago, Internet remembers, Internet is forever. And it just, this time needs to remind us that we work as journalists for 5 Ws and 1 H. And despite the tool we now have, which is the TikTok, the Twitter, social networks in general, Internet, we still have to adhere to those principles, because this is our job. We are someone who distinguishes fake news from the real news. So I would say that we have to work harder. We have to investigate harder, but nothing really changed. It's just brought some new perspectives to us. It is a tool that helps us at the same time, of course, but it has brought us many other points of views. We can communicate with the audience a lot easier. We can find new stories. We can see, for instance, in the last couple of months in Serbia, Twitter became again a very important source of information. I mean, Twitter is important in the Serbian society and in Serbian media landscape for quite some time. But a lot of information spreads through Twitter. And that being said, I think that despite the influence that social networks actually have, there is still room for us, and we have an important task. And that task is to remind our viewers and our consumers that we are the ones who sort of say, defend them from the fake news and from the information that actually is not information. So we are there to defend them from false information that spreads easily through all sorts of media or social networks and other platforms. So, as I said in the beginning, everything changed and nothing changed, because I still come to work every morning going through the newspapers and news portals and now social networks, and I start from there and go through fact-checking, go through deeper investigation, because unlike social networks where authors and sort of journalists are protected by their semi-anonymity, we are witnessing our consumers, our readers, our viewers with our first and last name. And I'm thinking that first and last name is actually something that protects people from false information, because we don't want to be the ones who are spreading false news. We don't want to be those who raise panic. We don't want to be somebody who is somebody's tool in propaganda. So I would say, yes, coming from the conventional media, that the tools that we now have with the social networks are not that great. They are useful sometimes, but we still need to do our homework. We still need to respond to the questions our viewers have and to work in the general and public interest. Because what changed? I'm wondering, did our work change apart from the technological side?
No, the principles remain the same, but the challenges and opportunities are greater. But I think the principles remain the same, yes.
Absolutely, absolutely. So when we talk about revolution, you said something yourself about revolution. We are experiencing revolution, and I'm thinking that now we are at the end of this transition point where we still have conventional media, you still have newspapers, you still have televisions, and I think that pandemic actually reminded us that traditional media are here to stay for at least quite some time.
We hope.
Yeah, fingers crossed. And remember, 2020, 2021, at least in Serbia, I'm wondering how was it in your countries? Television skyrocketed with the influence because everybody was turning to the relevant news sources. The televisions, the newspapers, the news portals are here for decades, and it is their capital. It is like the trust that was built over the decades.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really important point, and our American panelists, I'm sure, can speak to this more than me, but if you look at, let's say, Donald Trump, he would tweet a lot of things, but a lot of his base were not on Twitter, but it would make it onto TV. And once it made it onto TV is when it really exploded. It was still the thing to get to.
Absolutely, and I'm thinking with the Western Balkans, it's even more visible because in the Western Balkans, people are still, I'm thinking, trusting the television a lot more than many other news sources. I'm not sure what's the latest public opinion polls, but the television is a medium that is here to stay. And now I'm thinking that the question is how to integrate the new media and the television, and you'll see. I mean, the most important social network is still video. So I'm thinking that we are complement, and I'm remaining hopeful that we are complement.
I like this, very hopeful and optimistic.
So I'm looking forward to hearing your thoughts and to do a little bit of exchange. And once again, everything changed, nothing changed.
Thank you very much. I think we'll just move along. So if you'd like to.
Okay, so I love this country. This is actually my third time here because I have grandparents from Serbia. So I was stoked to come here, and what a weird weekend to be here, right? Couldn't go anywhere on Saturday, completely shut down with these protests. You search on Twitter, and they say 1 million in attendance, 1.5, 1.6, 10% of the country. And we know that's not true. The official number that the government said is 107,000, and then there's an outside group with the probably most accurate estimate, around 250,000. Nowhere near 1.5 million. But what were the protests really about? My husband and I went just to do some reporting out in the field, and that was odd, because they didn't really seem to be about anything. You know, we're used to, in the US, during our summer of riots and protesting 2020, it was all about lots of liberal social justice issues, police reform, some stuff about COVID, climate change, whatnot. These protests were odd because they're about this horrible tragedy from November 1st, the collapse of the Novi Sad train station canopy that killed 15 people, injured 2. This is something that Serbs should be mad about. This is something that there should be some accountability for. But what accountability were the protesters asking? 20% increase in higher education funding, relief from criminal charges for the protesters. There's one item that they asked for that was somewhat relevant, the release of the documents related to the railway reconstruction. We know this. 2 companies reconstructed this canopy, which was long overdue for reconstruction because it was a 50-year-old train station built under communism. China Railway Group Limited and China Communications Construction Company Limited. You would think that China would be of interest to the protesters, but they weren't. Not one of the demands has to do with transparency with the deals with Beijing, because we know if by Chinese law, all companies report to Beijing. They report to the communist government. What do the American and Western headlines say? They say the protests are anti-corruption, pro-democracy. The Telegraph said it was an anti-Putin protest because it's a lazy, easy narrative for Westerners to understand, right? We just think everything is about Putin. And the fact is it wasn't. There was one guy who was carrying a Ukrainian flag in support of Ukraine, and another protester pulled it away from him because they said, we don't support that. So this was in no way an anti-Putin protest. Sometimes in journalism, there is a bit of a noble lie, so we perceive. Like, for instance, the noble lie that just doesn't really get reported is that the Vučić administration's actually been extremely pro-Ukraine if you think about the real constraints of Serbia and Russia's historical friendship, Russia's historic support. The Vučić government's given, what, almost €1 billion in military support, but that doesn't really go that covered. Perhaps it's just because the West doesn't know how to cover Serbia. Perhaps it's also the noble lie of not making the Vučić government have to answer to its own people that probably are more pro-Russia than the government. But is it a noble lie to not cover the fact that the canopy that collapsed was built by Beijing? Is it ignorance on the part of the journalists, or sometimes do we in the media let social media dictate the trends? 75% of Serbs in a 2023 poll said that they view China as a friendly country, and 72% of young people specifically said that they support Chinese investment in Serbian infrastructure. And their main sources for news about China and Serbia's relationship, TV was 30% and the internet was 30%. What do you have there? When my husband and I got here, we would go to the hotel, flick on the guide, the channel guide, and there's an entire Chinese propaganda network just delivered. And if you don't like that, you could just flip open your phone and go onto TikTok. We know TikTok, the algorithm. Within China, they have a slightly different version of TikTok. It strongly bans youth from using it for more than, I believe it's 40 minutes a day. And what do they see in their feed? Patriotism, math, science and engineering, rocket science. What do they feed us? They feed us garbage and lies. And they make sure you can't mention Tiananmen Square on China. And guess what? If I were to guess, if someone went on TikTok and posted what I was saying right now, it'd get taken down like that. In the US, Donald Trump was the one who initially wanted to ban TikTok, right? And then Joe Biden lets it happen. And now Trump's not so sure, because it turns out the kids really like Trump, right? Trump did much better with young people this time around than ever before. And how easy would it be for journalists just to go along with it? How many of us get our TV bookings from our social media followings? How many of us get our stories picked up by sharing it on Twitter? I love Twitter. I'm a Twitter addict. It's the first thing I check in the morning, last thing at night. TikTok is the equivalent of, let's say, the Soviets buying CBS in the middle of the Cold War. Would the FCC have allowed that? No, patently not. So what makes TikTok any different? You could say we're not in a Cold War, but aren't we? Let's say you don't care about the plight of the Uyghur Muslims that are being genocided by the CCP, or all the millions of unborn who were aborted to suit the one China policy who were disproportionately girls. What about COVID? If you don't care about COVID, what about the 15 people that died because the Novi Sad canopy collapsed? And in COVID, we have the US, right, where, yes, in 2020, I think it was the best CNN's ratings ever were. You had Chris Cuomo, who, for those of you who aren't familiar with American politics and news media, Chris Cuomo was a CNN anchor, and his brother, Andrew Cuomo, was the governor of New York. And he would have Andrew Cuomo on doing sort of a jocular briefing about the state of the nation, while Andrew Cuomo stuck 15,000 COVID-positive seniors in nursing homes where they all infected each other in the first wave of the virus, killing them all. You wouldn't have known that if you watched CNN. We were told, don't wear masks. And then, not only do you have to wear a mask, your 2-year-old has to wear a mask. And if they don't get to go back to school until 2023. And, the vaccine will stop all transmission. We didn't know that. Why couldn't have they just trusted us with the data of saying it will drastically reduce the severity of a disease that is putting a lot of people in the hospital? What was the cost of that noble lie? One, nobody watches CNN anymore. Newsmax beats it in many hours, and Newsmax isn't even available on all TVs. New York Times runs a story this past weekend saying, we were misled about the lab leak. And why? Because racists on Twitter wanted to use it to blame China. The most real cost of the noble lies that journalists are complicit in, and I'm including myself in that, I'm definitely guilty of committing noble lies because it's noble. We think it's noble. But the big one, probably, vaccines. We've had our first 2 deaths in 10 years from measles because the kindergarten vaccination rate in West Texas is down to 48%. Totally preventable deaths because a bunch of people after COVID saw the media lie about the efficacy of the vaccines, which again, great at preventing death, not great at preventing transmission. And they think, I don't need the MMR vaccine that's been safely distributed to millions for 60 plus years. And I think with social media and with the profit incentive of all staying relevant, right? We're a dying industry. The fact that we're here means we spend all day posting, right? Because that's how you keep your job. We can't be complicit in the noble lies, especially the hard ones. And the reality is, you guys have done the real war reporting, right? I've never been hiding in a bunker in Ukraine. But we're all war reporting in the new Cold War, whether we like it or not.
Well said on that final point. You're absolutely correct. Thank you. Please.
I've been an investigative reporter at the Daily Caller News Foundation, where I've been working for 2 years. And I think as far as the time that I first had my introduction into journalism, into the media field, it's a very interesting and dynamic time compared to some of my panelists. I got started in student journalism in the middle of COVID-19, in the middle of these battles over identity politics in the summer of 2020. So I had my initial impression of this field in the middle of what was already a rough time for information. I noticed two things. I noticed, one, that my peers were getting a lot of their news from social media, a lot of not necessarily even news publications, just different accounts that were posting activist content, and that was really swaying how they were thinking, how they were viewing the world, and what their expectations were for other people. And I also saw that the media, the mainstream media, was really ignoring the concerns that a lot of everyday Americans had, as far as my panelists have mentioned, efficacy of masks, vaccines, lockdowns. These things were conversations that we could not have, that things that appeared, if you said they were true at the time, you would have been called out, but then just a few years later, now it's all coming out as accurate. And this, I think, really shaped my view personally of the importance of good reporting, the importance of having information that is solid and that people can make decisions based on and that is trustworthy. So just three big thoughts that I had on what it means to be a good reporter in the digital age. I think first, we need to not let this very real concern about disinformation and misinformation that is very rampant online detract from upholding our first principles as journalists. And what I mean by this is holding the line on free speech. So last year, I testified before the United States Congress, before the House Judiciary Committee, on some funding that was being directed through the National Science Foundation to about a dozen universities across the United States to develop AI-based misinformation, disinformation detection tools. And when you read these grants, a lot of them are targeting things like hate speech, targeting things like misinformation, and a lot of it ends up being conservative viewpoints that are targeted through these tools. And what was interesting is when I testified before the committee, there were emails that they had obtained after my reporting that showed this agency was trying to cast these tools as pro-democracy. They came up with a whole information strategy to define them after I reported on them. And I think it's important for us to not buy into this, that censoring information is pro-democracy. The solution to misinformation, false information, is better reporting, is more information, not cutting off streams of information. And this NSF example I share because I reported on it directly, but it's not the only example. During 2020, we had the Biden administration directly reaching out to social media platforms, asking them to take down content. this happened numerous times. And I think that as journalists, we need to be aware of this. We need to push back against this, and we need to not cave to this. Secondly, I think we need to also be aware that there is a real tendency for false news to spread on social media. A lot of narratives develop so quickly within hours on X, online, that we need to be really aware and do our due diligence, following the basic principles that journalists always have, double checking everything and not just taking things at face value. I think of during the election, there was this story that was going around that ProPublica, a news outlet, put out on abortion bans in the States, and arguing that it was killing women. But if you read the fine print of the article, it was actually the abortion pill, and that wasn't the news that was being reported. So I think that is one among many examples of just not allowing false narratives to spread and looking deeper and being able to pull out what is actually true and present that to people so they can make decisions and be able to be informed. Finally, I think we should just be open to these new opportunities. It is a great thing to have new reporters in the field. It's a great thing to have open access to information on Twitter. It's amazing that someone can sit on their laptop and look through all of this information. There's so much accessible to you online if you know where to look. And I think that, well, that is a double-edged sword. It does allow for people to use that for negative means. It also enables us to have more open discourse. And I think that's really exciting. I think that's a huge opportunity of the digital age that we should be looking forward to.
Thank you, Katelynn. I think that's absolutely spot on. And just before I pass it to Aleksandar, I want to take up a point you made. And we shouldn't really censor content. And I think that's interesting because I sort of do some policy work on this in Britain and indeed the US. And people often say, look, what do we do about all of this lying and misinformation, disinformation on Twitter and so forth? And I say, look, first of all, we've got to understand something. Lying is not illegal, nor should it be. You need lying. I love your mother. Your baby's beautiful. Like, you need to be able to tell little white lies every day. The second thing is a lot of this stuff, how can I put this? It's not illegal to be an arsehole. It's not pleasant, but you can't legislate this out of existence. Or if you try to, we go down a very dark path. So I always say to people, okay, we have this problem. First of all, there's certain things that are on Twitter and stuff that are just illegal, okay? Racism, incitement to violence, child porn, that stuff just needs to be off, but that's actually an enforcement issue. So I say to them, look, stop getting so obsessed on the content, which sounds counterintuitive. Some people aren't pleasant. Some people tell lies. So I always think a way to deal with some of this stuff is don't look at content, look at behavior. Now, what does that mean? It means that if John from DC or Arkansas or London or Paris wants to say that Donald Trump kicked a puppy, okay, fine. If it turns out that John from Arkansas or London or DC is in fact, Vlad from Moscow or somewhere else, and this is actual fake behavior, then that's when you can start to take things down legitimately, I think. But you're absolutely right. We need to be careful about censoring stuff we just don't like or that actually is untrue, unless it causes actual public danger, etc. Okay, so thank you for that. Aleksandar, if you'll close out the session, or at least as far as the panelists are. Thank you.
Thank you very much, David. So, since I come from North Macedonia, obviously I wanted to start the whole opening remarks with the fire that happened, the tragedy that happened in Kočani. Unfortunately, thank you to the organizers that commemorate these tragically lost lives. But since David brought the big guns at the beginning, talking about Ukraine, and Stefan talking about technology, how it changed journalism or didn't change, I want to address a really important subject, and that is connected with the subject that we are talking about today, the future of journalism. We are all 30-plus people here. We are all working maybe in traditional media, new media, but we need to think about the future, and the future are the young people. I was involved a lot with a project that is, sorry, I have I'm a bit nervous, but I will calm down. So I was involved in a project involving 40 schools in Macedonia, in North Macedonia, primary schools and high schools. So I went there, and I'm part of the informal, let's say, part of the education about media literacy, etc., etc. So I talk to people who is informing them, the young people, who is informing the young audience. You would expect that it is well-established online media. Maybe, of course, they are not sitting in front of the television. They are not buying print media. For example, I have a 10-year-old kid who is never seen a print media, never seen a newspaper. The first time when I brought him a newspaper, he was trying to zoom in the newspaper in order to make the letters bigger. So can you imagine that we are talking about totally different audiences. And these people, 80% of these people who are primary school children and high school children are talking about, they are informing themselves from Instagram channels and from TikTok channels. But when I say who is informing you, whether it's a well-established media or somebody else, they are talking about channels of people who have avatars. They don't have a real name. So 80% across Macedonia, young people are informed themselves from these kind of social media networks, and ask them, do you believe the content that is produced on that social media? And they don't understand, first of all, the concept of not believing. Yeah, it must be true. They post it, they cover it as news, and we must believe it. They don't have the critical mindset to understand that these people are maybe misleading them. They are spreading disinformation, etc., etc. And I just challenge these young people, whether you would believe more if this person was with his real name. Aleksandar Manasiev, for example, as a journalist, comes out and produces his content, produces his news, and whether they will believe him more or not. So they don't have the critical mindset. So we need to understand. And I'm sure that this is not just happening in the Western Balkan region, but also I think that all over the world, young audiences are informing themselves through social media. So I would argue whether nothing changed or everything changed, and should we as media professionals change in order to attract young audiences and cut the spread of misinformation, disinformation, etc., etc. So next thing I would say that there is a real rise of this kind of content creators who are not educated journalists. I'm not against that. Either you are a journalist or pretend to be a journalist, but we all know what is good journalism, basically. You all talked about concepts that the pillars of journalism are the same. But did the digital age, did this 20 years of constant change, like the online media, the social media, the AI technology, mobile journalism, and everything, did it change something that we need to change, maybe our ethical framework as journalists, as organizations? For example, the ethical code of journalists of Macedonia was brought up in 2001. So you have 24 years of change. And the self-regulatory bodies, we have two self-regulatory bodies who deal with complaints. The Association of Journalists is dealing with the complaints of journalists, against journalists. And we have an ethical council, which is dealing with the complaints against media. So they have like hundreds of complaints against media, against journalists, that deal with the new trends, new technology. For example, comments online. Should we moderate them or not? It's not written in the current ethical codes. I'm just saying that here in the Western Balkan region, we face a lot of dilemmas, a lot of problems that this new era brought us. And on the other hand, for example, when I started journalism, when I entered into journalism school 2001, there were 100 people applying for the faculty of journalism. Now, there are 5 to 7 people every year. So journalism is not an attractive business, probably in the Western Balkan region. I'm talking to professionals also in Serbia, in Montenegro, in Bosnia. The numbers are very low. Everybody wants to work PR. Nobody wants to work journalism. So these content creators fill the gap in order to inform the, let's say, the audiences that is underrepresented. And that is basically the young audience or some other smaller groups of people, etc., etc. I'm just opening a dilemma whether we should rethink our way of journalism or we should rethink of, let's say, absorbing these content creators into the whole journalistic community and at least to teach them the basic principles of journalism, of ethical reporting, responsible reporting, etc., etc.
Well, thank you. You may have been nervous, but that was really good and really interesting. Could we have a brief hand for our panelists, please? Thank you very much. So I think we've got a bit more time, don't we? I'd like to... Do we have any questions from the floor?
If I may add something, I was carefully listening to Aleksandar, and I was sort of on the same page with you up until a few weeks ago with following the student protests here in Serbia. But you were mentioning your son being surprised by how we were consuming information before when you spoke about the newspaper. But 2 points. Just with the student protests in Serbia, a lot of foreign journalists came to Belgrade to cover it. And I spoke with one of the reporters who worked for some American and some British outlets, including BBC and CNN, Al Jazeera also. And we were discussing, should we adapt the conventional media to the new audiences, to adapt to TikTok or Twitter? Is there any room left for us? And he said something, I'm not on the same page with him, but I would say it's something also to think about, especially when you mention regulation. And that is, why don't they fight for us? You know, like maybe they should be the ones who adapt to the standards. Because when you look, I'm not sure what's the regulation like in Britain or in the US, but when you look at the regulation about the media here in the Western Balkans, I'm thinking that for the major part, the regulation recognizes conventional media. So it's also part of the system. So also a question for the policymakers and the decision makers. Should we introduce, or when should we introduce the sort of new media into the law? And that being said, speaking about the student protests, I'm also thinking when you mentioned that they are mostly focused on the new media, but then again, they were focused on the media outlets, the conventional media outlets, including public broadcaster. So I'm guessing we're somewhere in between. There are young people who are well aware of their surroundings and who are very well informed, despite the fact that we think of them that as a part of the new generation, which is actually only relying on the information coming from influencer YouTubers or bloggers. Just an observation.
I mean, it's interesting. How do you regulate social media, especially jurisdictionally? I would like to ask our American panelists, what do you think? What are your thoughts on possible regulation of social media?
Media content on social media, maybe to be precise.
So in the U.S., there's a Supreme Court precedent where, in order to be found liable for defaming a public figure, you have to say something that is false, know that it is false, and prove that it actually was defamatory. And the reason why is because public figures are fair game, right? And unless you have video of, oh, I know Donald Trump didn't hit the, what was the metaphor, hit the cat?
Puppy.
Kick the puppy. Unless you have, an exculpatory piece of evidence, you can be an idiot on Twitter and just tweet, I know Donald Trump kicked the puppy, right? And there's a debate over whether or not some Republican jurisdiction will try and get the stipulation overturned, right? To make it easier to clear that bar for defaming public figures. Why have we seen that? And why have we seen a bunch of blockbuster lawsuits against CNN and the like in the US in recent years? And it's in part because we as the media have done such a terrible job of upholding our own standards. And I mean, I'm coming at this obviously from a conservative bent because I am a conservative economics columnist. But it's partially because the institutional corporate media in the US does tend to lean liberal, and that's also where all the money is, right? But I would never favor more regulations in our industry. I would never favor relaxing defamation law to make it easier. I've been sued for defamation before, and I have won. But if we don't do it ourselves, Elon Musk buys Twitter, right? Because Twitter suppressed the news story about the Hunter Biden laptop right before the 2020 election. And polls tend to indicate that that actually helped swing the election for Joe Biden. He won it fairly, but still, Twitter kind of rigged the rules because they were trying to suppress journalism. And a bunch of journalists went along with it, right? NPR was trying to justify it by saying, oh, this is Russian disinformation, it's a hoax. And it wasn't. It was legitimate, excellent reporting that we were all actually very jealous of and wish that we had gotten that scoop. So I think we have to be better at not doing that, because otherwise Elon Musk will buy our newspaper, or Jeff Bezos will fire our editorial board, or some billionaire is going to bankroll a challenge to New York Times versus Sullivan.
Yeah, I think that's very well put. So, I mean, I find it very interesting. So these platforms are American platforms, right? Now, the First Amendment, freedom of speech is so baked into American culture, you can never overtly mess with it. But what happens when so much of the public sphere becomes private? In the sense that, in the end, it is Elon Musk's company, right? And he can throw you off because it's a private company. So I haven't quite thought this, or I'm just thinking, what do you do when large parts of the public sphere become private companies? There was this thing, and I don't know, where apparently a woman who claimed he'd had a kid with her had to tweet, look, you're not replying to my things. Now, I'm not going to talk about the man's family, it's none of my business, but apparently she was shadow banned, So I think this raises questions of freedom of speech. And let me ask you as well, sorry, Katelynn, the same question, as I said, to our American panelists.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting question. I think the issue with regulation is it can also backfire, right? Like you can create a situation where people are less trustful because it's being regulated and they don't know if the regulation is only going in one direction. And I think that's the danger you run into when you try to do that. And that's why you really just, it does fall onto journalists just to be responsible, to be the ones who are being trustworthy. And I think it's not something that should be pawned off onto into government regulations. I think the question of private platforms, though, is interesting and is one that is going to have to be grappled with more, because that's a different situation.
It is, and when I give a lot of these talks, I sometimes say, I ask a question: how long were movies silent for? Not before they even had color, and it was 30 odd years. 30 years before movies even had sound. So imagine just actually how early on in the evolution of social media we are. Really, I mean, okay, Facebook came out when I was at college in 2004. I'm that old. But, I mean, when did it really cut through? 2010? We're still in the early days, and we don't know how to even conceptualize them, I think. I remember there was a big scandal in Australia. The Australian government had a fallout with Mark Zuckerberg. So they switched off Facebook for a bit. They were like, look, there's like fire service, send out messages here. This is really important. That you cannot do this. But the fact is he could, because it is his company. So is it just a private company, or is it so important now? Some people say it's like a utility, like the gas, the electricity. We don't know, and I think that's an important thing, and we still have to understand how much actually relatively we're still in the infancies of these technologies. Yes, sir, you had a hand up.
Tim Doescher from Unleash Prosperity in the United States of America. Just a big debate happening in Washington, D.C. right now is defunding National Public Radio, NPR, Voice of America, funding news by the government. I'm curious for our friends from North Macedonia and Serbia, the role of government media in your respective countries. As a journalist, can you weigh in on the debate going here in America with your individual situations as they stand?
Great question, please.
I can address to that. So Voice of America and Radio Free Liberty, for example, are present in North Macedonia. A lot of my friends work there, a lot of good media professionals, good journalists. I would say that they are doing in the past, let's say 10, 20 years, how much they're present. They are doing good journalism, basically. They are very respected in the society. They don't have a big audience, I would say, a huge audience. But they are not that much politically involved in the situation that is happening in the country itself, for example. Okay, we didn't have so much political disturbances in our country. We had one, let's say, revolution, but they were basically covering it as any national media from Macedonia. They were not backing somebody or voting for, cheering for somebody. Okay, yes, they covered basically, maybe not neutrally, because you have to understand the Balkan region context. When you say you are neutral and you go to politician A, you ask him whether it's raining outside, he will say no, it's not raining outside. You go to politician B, he is going to say it's raining outside. And neutrality means that what I'm going to report. So I go outside and see for myself whether it's raining or not. I'm saying that politicians, for example, here in the Balkan region, lie often. Will lie about everything. For example, the tragedy that happened in Kočani. You take the whole situation as an onion. For example, you see the onion. You got one side of the onion, corruption. You peel another side of the onion, you find something else. You go every bit of the onion and you find really deeply rooted corruption. That is actually the problem of that tragedy, for example, the root of the tragedy. Going back to how they report and how they perceive, I think that they are perceived as a very established international media outlet who is respected, very often are cited in other media. For example, they are not, I don't know, breaking news or something like that, not a lot of investigative stories, but I would say a proper, okay, journalism from my point of view, if that's the answer to your question.
May I? I would add up something that is very important. Free Europe and Voice of America were media lifelines during the 90s here in the region. So you have to bear in mind that we were under very strong propaganda, strong censorship, and Radio Free Europe, for instance, was the one my parents used to tune in every day, I think, at 6 p.m. just to get the real news. Also, they were the ones who made connections between the sides in war in Bosnia. So that was the real and the first dialogue that actually began in the first half of the 90s through Radio Free Europe. When the war broke out, when Yugoslavia collapsed, and when Milosevic took over here, he expelled most of prominent journalists from a public broadcaster. They all started working at Free Europe and continued their professional work. So it should be perceived from that perspective as well. It is. I'm guessing that there are people in DC who now say that it's a waste of taxpayers' money, but also it has a very useful. It was very useful for us here. It's a journalism school. People who work there are real journalists, even today.
A check against, I don't want to say against, but it's still a check and balance on the existing media here in Serbia and North Macedonia, I guess so.
Well, yeah, go ahead.
I would say, for example, yes, because they set certain standards. For example, BBC on Macedonian was existing, I don't know, 10 years ago. There was a real gap when they stopped producing news on Macedonian language. Fortunately enough, Deutsche Welle came Radio Free Liberty it was working, Voice of America was more active, created, let's say, not just one journalist who was covering here, but let's say engage 3 or 5 journalists. They are setting some standards in terms of, when I was talking about the ethical standards, we as a profession have ethical standards on the level on national level. But it should be actually like a BBC, like Voice of America. They should have inside ethical codes, ethical frameworks, etc., etc. And they were the medias who were openly publishing their editorial guidelines, for example. Something unknown for the media sector in the Western Balkans. When you open the Macedonian television, for example, Macedonian public broadcaster, you cannot find ethical guidelines or editorial policy or something like that, you know? So how can you trust a certain media when they, even nowadays, 30 years after the independence of our countries, don't have that minimum standards? So I think that if something happens, I mean, if they stop producing news, Radio Free Liberty and Voice of America, there would be a gap in the informational sector in my country, for example.
Which will be fairly quickly filled by somebody from the east.
Exactly. Yeah. Even the nearer or the further east, I think we can say.
I would say in Serbia both.
Yeah, God. Okay, that's great. Do we have any other questions from the floor? Okay. I know that we're sort of coming up to the time limit, but I want to ask a question, actually, to close this out. I want to hear from each of you. What is your biggest challenge, do you think? Is the biggest challenge you have faced personally of reporting in the digital age? Can you think of it? And perhaps, if you can, you know, what you think of the biggest plus side of it, for you personally, I mean, in your career.
Shall we start?
Yeah, please.
I'm dealing with it for the past 10 years, and that is Twitter, in terms of fighting or arguing with my editors who see something on Twitter and then take it as a fact, and then you have to debunk it and to refute it. Yeah, and it's like a digging or working in a mine. So that's one of my biggest challenges. On the other hand, I mean, Twitter is a huge source of information. But I'm actually surprised that we didn't touch upon the AI. Yes. And I just recently went on a workshop where we spoke about AI and its usage in journalism. So I would like to share a piece of information from there, and that is, you know, I'm thinking we were all afraid that AI will come and take our places, but then again, I'm thinking it will just put a little bit more work on us, like the rest of the technology we're covering today, because it only does the writing, whereas thinking still remains with us. So maybe something to touch upon.
Most of us anyway.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
I will say this isn't a personal struggle for me, but just to yes and just something with AI. I am so scared for this young generation, how much they've normalized cheating in university with it, that like the plagiarism issue is going to explode, and it's up to us to be good stewards of the profession and try and inculcate good habits in the next generation. For me personally, it's been constantly disappointing an audience that has become so sensitized because they've been able to create their own echo chamber, right? You get to choose who you follow on Twitter. You get to choose which stations you have, and now with most people cutting cable, you get to choose, oh, I just want News Nation and MSNBC, or I just want Newsmax and Fox News. And to their credit, I actually think the stations have done a lot better than at keeping a wide variety of viewpoints than actually individuals themselves do in their Twitter feeds. Because I know I'm constantly, you know, I voted for Donald Trump and I wrote a piece about why I voted for Donald Trump. And then I have followers who are like, why are you criticizing Trump starting a pissing match with Canada? And it's like, because you can support someone or support a policy and still point out, no, this will not this will not bring down the inflation rate. No, slashing all of our VOA funding doesn't make a single dent in our $6.7 trillion worth of outlays that we had last year. So I think it's just audiences themselves. They don't want to hear things they don't want. You want to be all team blue or all team red or all this. And so just, I guess, I would encourage audiences, have some follows in your feed that disappoint you. I think it's good for you.
Well said again. Yes, be disappointed a bit more. And don't coddle yourself constantly, because it's not the real world. You will be disappointed, trust me. Thank you.
I'd like to second some of that and also just add that I think there's a struggle in keeping up with the pace of information and identifying what issues are worth looking into or worth highlighting for an audience. I think especially when developments are happening so rapidly, it's important to be able to see that and highlight not just what the audience wants, but what is true and what needs to be said. And I think sorting through that is something that is a skill that needs to be developed, especially when algorithms are curating content and creating echo chambers like that.
Absolutely. Well said. And finally, Aleksandar.
For me, biggest challenge in the digital age was in 2017 when I started. Since then, I worked in two digital, let's say, media, digital-born media. Let's say we didn't have any website. We only produced content for social media. So the biggest challenge for me at that time was user-generated content. So pictures and videos that we got from the public, to verify them, to double-check them, and then to publish them. And it's still becoming a challenge because of AI, because of the new technology. Everybody can produce a small change in the video can be fake news. So this is still becoming a challenge.
Absolutely. I think it's a challenge for all of us. Okay, I think we're going to leave it there. We're up against time. This was a really fascinating discussion. Thank you again for inviting us. And please give another hand for my panel. Thank you. Thank you very much.